Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Monday, Memorial Day, May 29th, 2023. And if you'd like additional weather information on top of what I provide in this broadcast, you can go to weather.gov. If you go online, you'll come to a map here of the continental U.S. And if you point and click anywhere on this map, including Hawaii and Alaska to the lower left, you can get information for anywhere in the nation. Looking at the lower 48 this Monday afternoon, frost advisories for northern New England, western Maine, northern New Hampshire. We have air quality alerts, portions of lower Michigan, southern Wisconsin, southeast Minnesota, even a red flag warning for critical fire weather conditions of the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. Severe thunderstorm watch in Nebraska, and then back to the west, some flood watches, even flash flood watches for potential for heavy thunderstorm rains causing flash flooding across burn scars there in areas of the Sierra Mountains of eastern California. Well, our flooding threat continues across the state, especially on the Yukon River system. The upper Yukon River is beginning to slowly recede there up at Dawson City down through Fort Yukon. Flood warnings remain in effect for snowmelt. Stevens Village, though the water level there is starting to show some signs of coming down a little bit. But water level is going to stay very high in all of the rivers here for the next week or two very easily. Further downstream, we have flood warnings, Imanik and Alakanuk, as a result of the potential for ice jams right there at the delta as it tries to dump into the Bering Sea. So those areas remain under flood warnings, and those will continue here into the week ahead. Flood advisories from Grayling down through Yukon Delta as a result of just the high water moving through the lower Yukon basin. And we've had a very cool and wet Memorial Day across portions of the east central interior, with as much as 1 to 2 inches of rain expected through tomorrow, Tuesday. So here is an image from Beaver there on the Yukon River. Mostly cloudy skies, 52 degrees, a bit cooler. Some of the warmest temperatures are a little further northwest of there. Bettles has been around 60 degrees this afternoon. That's one of the warmer temperatures statewide. Kotlik there down in the delta, overcast skies. Kotlik is under a flood advisory there in the lower Yukon. We have temperature at 38 degrees. Colder air is pushing in along areas of the west and northwest coast associated with the cold front pushing inland. And then Noaa Bridge, which is between Delta Junction and Tok, areas of rain, 46 degrees. This is the areas here that could pick up an inch or two of rainfall through tomorrow. And Juneau seeing some scattered showers and only 45 degrees. Juneau had temperatures up around 80 not all that long ago. Well, here on the river breakup map, the areas of current warnings, I should say the whole Yukon River has high water, more so once you get below the Yukon Flats, but Stevens Village still under a flood warning, though the trend has been for the water to be slowly coming down through this upper stretch of the Yukon. Middle Yukon very high, still lowland, high water and flooding near, within the floodplain. Down here, though, from Grayling, Anvik, all the way down to the delta, we have flood advisories with ongoing snowmelt flooding, and then the delta, the immediate delta as it dumps into the sea. And of concern has been the shorefast ice, but there are some signs. Our ice desk was able to analyze some satellite imagery, and it looks like we're getting melting of the shorefast ice, not only on the land side, but on the sea side. So that's good news, and hopefully that shrinkage will help reduce the threat of ice jams becoming too big of a problem in the lower Yukon Delta. But that is going to be really closely monitored by the ice team as we go through this week, because it's really the last big trouble spot on the Yukon River we have to deal with, at least with the breakup ice. As far as ongoing snowmelt flooding, that'll continue for the next week or two, because it takes a long time for all that water to move through the big Yukon system. Look at this. Here it is, Memorial Day weekend. Fire danger danger low across the state. If you compare that to last year, we were in the midst of a fast and furious early fire season. Fortunately, this year, one benefit with a cloud cover, occasional wet weather, cooler temperatures, it has really put the dampener on fire starts. Now we're watching low pressure just circulating here in the Gulf, not especially strong, but it's pumping moisture up into areas of the Gulf Coast and up through the Panhandle with scattered showers, and then back here, a broader area of rain, say from North Waytoke up to near Fairbanks. These areas here could see locally an inch or two of rain, especially if you have any upslope enhancement. Cold front working its way now into the West Coast. Nome had some snow earlier today, and certainly don't be surprised if you see some snow and snow showers up along those areas as we go through tonight and on Tuesday. So here's the low in the Western Gulf, not especially strong, but just keeping the instability as one low sits and spins. Another piece of energy is going to drop down along this cold front, and that's going to help. By the time we get into Tuesday afternoon, it's going to get the next low going. There's another low pulling piece of energy that's going to pull back to the north and west. So not a pattern that's going that leans toward a warm up and sunny weather, though we might see areas of south central enjoy a little more sun here late in the week, Thursday, Friday, along with some warmer temperatures, maybe getting back up around or even above 60 degrees for a change. But until then, still staying mostly cloudy, rather cool, occasionally some showers spitting at us. And as we go into Wednesday, yeah, there's yet another low sitting down here in the North Pacific lower Gulf interface with trough extending back up along the Gulf Coast and Panhandle. Temperature-wise, readings stay above freezing across the Panhandle and in through south central areas, maybe dipping down in the 30s, Copper River Basin, especially if you're getting the breaks in the clouds. But notice with mostly cloudy skies and still some lingering showers, areas of rain, highs at best, low mid-50s in the Panhandle. Same thing here, Anchorage Bowl, back toward, say, Soldotna, only temperatures around lower mid-50s. Wednesday morning, similar lows, upper 30s to lower 40s, and temperatures generally around or a bit above 40 in the Panhandle. And again, temperatures across south central and the Panhandle generally in the 50s here Wednesday. But if we can get some sun starting Thursday, some areas could finally get back up around 60. Temperatures stay around or just above 40 along the middle upper Yukon River, but near and below freezing along the Chukchi Sea coast and the Arctic coast, and then going into Tuesday afternoon, maybe 64 there at Yukon Flats, but 50s otherwise there through the Tanana Valley. And Wednesday morning, lows generally below freezing along the Arctic coast, especially the northwest coast down toward Shishmaref and Wales, and then 62 maybe at best for Fort Yukon, near 60 perhaps at Fairbanks. Southwest temperatures stay actually dip near freezing along the outer coast, back up near lower 40s, and so this is very cool. Below normal temperatures across this region will continue through midweek. Highs still failing to hit 50 there across the southwest coast. Looking at the temperature outlook, June 4th through the 8th, could see above normal temperatures across northern parts of the mainland and southern portions of the Panhandle, but still below normal, especially surrounding Cook Inlet and back out across the Alaska Peninsula. And precipitation may average a bit above normal again across areas of the west and southern mainland, extending into portions then of the northern Panhandle and northeastern Gulf Coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Let's take a look now at your aviation weather. If you have a flight planned Tuesday or on Wednesday, we're going to have a couple areas we're watching. We have low pressure circulations over the northeastern Gulf, over Bristol Bay, northern parts of the Alaska Peninsula, and then way up in the Arctic Ocean, north of the Chukchi Sea. Widespread, though, IFR conditions are expected Tuesday morning along the Arctic coast, down through the Chukchi Sea coastline, Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, YK deltas into Bristol Bay, and then westward all the way out along the length of the Aleutian chain. Also some areas of IFR extending across the central into the eastern Alaska range, inner coastal mountains around Prince William Sound, Wrangell, St. Elias, and then back through especially the inner channels and the inner coastal mountains of the Panhandle. Tuesday afternoon, ceilings lift, things do improve a bit across the southwest and Gulf Coast. We expect more in the way of MVFR conditions, at least at the heart of the day in the afternoon. Still IFR hugging just along the the Arctic coast, Kaktovik through Utqiagvik, and then also IFR conditions along the central and western Aleutians. Wednesday morning, widespread IFR conditions along the north slope, Arctic coast, Kaktovik, all the way down through Point Lay and Hope, and then as the north side of the Seward Peninsula, also out over the central Bering and in the central western Aleutians and pockets of IFR. Central Alaska Range, west side of Prince William Sound, Wrangell, St. Elias, back through the inner coastal mountains there of the Panhandle. And by Wednesday afternoon, we find conditions improve along the Alaska Range, Gulf, and Panhandle to MVFR. Widespread VFR conditions are expected across the Yukon River Valley, and still IFR there, Dead Horse to Kaktovik, and then also IFR from St. Matthew out across the central and western Aleutians. Past conditions Tuesday, Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass there in the east central Brooks Range, MVFR. In the west arm of the Alaska Range, IFR starts out today at Lake Clark, IFR holding at Merrill Pass, and as we round up through Rainy Pass, Windy Pass, and Isabel Pass, all of those will start with IFR early in the day, giving way to MVFR conditions. Mentasta Pass further east, MVFR becoming VFR. Across the Copper River Valley, Tanita Pass starts out with IFR in the morning, giving way to MVFR. Same thing, Portage Pass, IFR conditions, the eastern half of the pass into Prince William Sound in the morning, becoming MVFR throughout the entire pass as we go through afternoon. And Chilkoot and White, we look for IFR conditions early in the day, giving way to MVFR conditions. Freezing levels aloft are lowest along areas of the inner coastal mountains of the Gulf Coast and Panhandle, and also over just southwest of the Gulf in the North Pacific, and back up across areas of the northern Bering and Chukchi Seas. Freezing levels aloft are below 2,000 feet. They are above 6,000 feet, though. A little warmer air up along the central eastern Brooks Range into the Canadian Arctic coast, and also once you get east of the eastern Aleutians, or west rather, freezing levels bump up to 8,000 feet across the central and western Aleutians. Greatest threat for icing on Tuesday will be in some of the thicker cloud cover producing precipitation over the Panhandle above 5,000 feet, eastern interior above 8,000 feet into northwest Canada, and then a broad area over the southwest, including Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays above 5,000 feet. Upper level winds at 30,000 feet or jet stream level. We have two low circulations, one in the northeastern Gulf, another over in the vicinity of Bristol Bay, and then another way up in the Arctic Ocean north of the Chukchi Sea. If we bring it down to 700 millibars, 9,000 feet, we still see those three circulations. And on the backside of the low over the eastern and central Bering, winds at 9,000 feet are out of the northeast to north in excess of 50 knots. Bring it down to 3,000 feet, and there is a broad belt of wind over the eastern portion of the Bering Sea that ranges from 35 to as high as 50 knots just in the vicinity of Nunavik Island. And this is going to translate to a broad area of considerable moderate turbulence across the eastern Bering Sea, and then across areas of the eastern Aleutians and the southern half of the Alaska Peninsula. Within this broad region, these north-northwest winds could cause a considerable amount of turbulence. Surface to 3,000 feet in the eastern Aleutians, surface to 4,000 feet there across the southern half of the Alaska Peninsula, and then surface to 3,000 feet in the vicinity of St. Lawrence, St. Matthew, and Nunavik Island.
Welcome to this edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Carrie Haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. With me today, I have Dr. Doug Wesley, a physical scientist for the National Weather Service Alaska Region Headquarters. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Carrie. Hello.
Hello. So you're here to talk to us a little bit about something called CocoRAS, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And I understand that CocoRAS is a network of volunteers who take weather observations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what CocoRAS is?
Yes, it began in the lower 48, 20 some years ago, and it's expanded during those 2 decades. They're getting something like 10 to 15,000 rainfall reports per day from the lower 48.
Wow, that's a lot of different reports. So how many reports do we get in Alaska right now?
Well, it varies. Maybe 10 to 25. But if you consider the large areas we're talking about, we have a lot of gaps to fill. Any observation is better than no observation, but there are large areas in Alaska. Alaska covers 3 million square miles. There's a lot of data gaps in that space, so we'd like to enhance it.
Sure. So tell us then a bit about why these observations are so important to Alaska and why we need to expand the number of them that we're getting.
Yes, Alaska, as you know, has large areas with a lot of complex terrain, and there are no weather observing stations or radar. So CoCoRaHS can help fill the data gaps, so you can at least get some idea of what's actually falling from the sky at those locations. CoCoRaHS increases the amount of timely weather observations available to meteorologists and other decision makers, especially in hazardous type of weather, both rain and snow and the occasional hailstorm that we get up here. CoCoRaHS observations can help forecasters identify long-term precipitation and snowfall trends in a climate sense. And just overall, they increase the amount of timely weather observations available to the public.
So then let's talk a little bit about each of the different types of observations. So it's the rain, hail, and snow network. So let's start by talking a little bit about rain observations, and tell us a little bit about how you take those and how long it takes a volunteer to get a rain observation.
Okay, this is a 4-inch gauge, just the basic gauge, which you use for both rain and snowfall. But the rain observations are pretty quick. It's a matter of 2 to 3 minutes that each volunteer goes out and takes a reading, and then they enter these on the computer, and they're immediately available for observation on the computer and on the maps, so that you can see your report. In the wintertime, it's a little bit more complicated. We require the observers to measure not only the snow accumulation, but also liquid equivalent. So they've got to melt the snowfall. This involves 2 of these gauges and a snowboard. And it's, it's maybe a 10-minute observation per day during the winter. But the snowfall is so variable that even across town and in especially the remote areas, it's crucial that we increase this number of snow observations in the network.
Right. I understand that we can only take observations in places where we have weather service offices, and so we rely on all of these volunteers to help us fill gaps. And it's also interesting to know how snowfall varies across large spaces or even small cities. So I noticed here in Anchorage, for example, we can have a vastly different amount of snow on the east side of town and the west side of town. And so it seems like these observations would help us to better understand what's going on in places besides just where the office is.
That's correct. In any given snowfall, there are typically large variances, as you know, and we rely on reports from the public and from National Weather Service cooperative spotters to map out the snowfall that occurs so that we can predict it better in the future.
Sure. So we talked about rain observations and we talked about snow observations, and you said for each of those, if it's rain, it only takes a couple minutes, and then it can take about 10 minutes if it's snow. Hail was the other one that we didn't talk about yet. Tell us just a little bit about the hail observations that CoCoRaHS observers take.
Yeah, the CoCoRaHS network, it has a hail pad, and it's just a simple block of styrofoam covered with aluminum foil, and you can approximate the size of hail by measuring the dent that the hail causes on the pad, and this can give us an estimate of hail size. We don't get hail very often in Alaska, but I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my 5 years in Anchorage, and some of it up to a ½ inch, and I'm sure there's been larger hail up in the interior at times.
So let's talk a little bit about how these rain, hail, and snow observations can help forecasters. So we have people who forecast the weather, and we also have people who work on the hydrology side, and I can see that maybe CoCoRaHS will be beneficial to both of them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it's beneficial to the hydrologic forecaster who's concerned about flooding, and rainfall comprises one of the causes of a flood, or it can exacerbate high water conditions. So the more the hydrologist has to look at in terms of data from recent rainfall, the more information they have to work with when they're generating a forecast. You know, the weather forecasters in the wintertime at the Weather Service office can use these observations also to help with past case studies, to verify model data, and to get a handle on what's actually happening out the window. And that's important in the forecast process.
Yeah, it seems like you can never have too much information when you're issuing a forecast. So it only takes a few minutes most of the time to take these observations. So let's say I'm interested in becoming a volunteer for CocoRa's. How do I get involved?
Yeah, the website is very useful, cocoras.org, and it has a number of video-based training tutorials that take you right on from measuring rainfall to a video tutorial on measuring snowfall. It has the maps available in real time, and you can go back and look at that old data too through those maps. And so it's a very useful, comprehensive website.
Very interesting. And anybody can get involved, right? You don't have to be a meteorologist.
That's right. And, you know, we love to have 24, once a day reports throughout the year, but if you can't, then so be it. And we have observers, some observers are out of town for periods of time, or maybe they can only report, you know, a week or two of precipitation, but it's still useful. It's still data that we look at. So the more the better, but you can get involved even if you aren't at a location 24/7.
Doug, I really appreciate you coming on to our program today to talk about CocoRa's. Hopefully we can have you back in the studio at some point so we can talk more about it and then talk more about the different types of observations and the tools that observers use.
That would be great, yeah.
So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for joining this edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome, everybody, and we're going to take a look at the sea ice here as we begin our marine weather segment. Ice is extensive along the Arctic coast. As we drop down through the northwest lower Chukchi Sea coastline, we are seeing more in the way of open water beginning to develop, especially west of Point Lay and areas of the lower Chukchi Sea through the Bering Strait, and especially between the Russian coast and the north side of St. Lawrence Island. Still some areas of ice there in through the central portion of Norton Sound, and we have pack ice lingering out over areas of the north central Bering to just off the southwestern coast, particularly off of the lower Yukon Delta. A little shore-fast ice here, but there are signs that that is eroding away, as I mentioned earlier in the show. It's melting on both the riverside and the seaside, so that's good news. Hopefully there will not be too serious of an ice jam flooding issue there as we go through this week. Otherwise, for the inner channels of the Panhandle, winds will be southerly on Tuesday with winds at 10 to 15 knots, waves 2-3 feet. Outer coast, look for south winds south of Sitka, turning more easterly once you get west of Gustavus and up through Yakutat at about 10 knots, waves generally running 5-6 feet. And then as we look at the northwestern Gulf, up in the corner there in Prince William Sound, light winds variable, only around 10 knots. Look for east to southeast winds 15 knots into the entrance of Cook Inlet, and then southerly winds of 20 knots from off of Anchor Point on up to the north portion of Cook Inlet with waves of 5 to 6 feet. And on Wednesday, more of the same here in the northwest corner of the Gulf, kind of weak low pressure in general in this area, and we're seeing winds only 10 knots off the Kenai and in Prince William Sound, also at the entrance of Cook Inlet, but southwest winds 15 knots, middle and upper Cook Inlet with waves 2 to 4 feet. Across Across the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, look for generally west to southwest winds. They'll be 15 to 20 knots across the northern half, 25 to 30 knots through the lower southern half. Waves 2 to 4 feet on the North Pacific side and 4 to as high as 9 feet north of Cold Bay there once you get into more of the open waters. And then for Wednesday, winds will be northerly 15 knots, Shelikof Strait, northeasterly on the east side of Kodiak Island to 20 knots, but still northwesterly winds at least above 20 knots to even near 30 knots to the southeast there of False Pass. Waves running 2 to 4 feet on the North Pacific side and 5 to as high as 9 feet on the Bering side, especially there again north of Cold Bay. Across the Aleutian chain, the eastern and central Aleutians, northwesterly winds 25 to 30 knots, eastern Aleutians dropping off to 20 knots, then kind of a mixed bag as you get out west of Adak, and waves generally 5-6 feet North Pacific side and 4 to as high as 9 feet outside of on Alaska. And then on Wednesday, there is a sense of a high pressure ridge through this region, though winds could be northwesterly as high as 25 to 30 knots, eastern Aleutians. Turning back toward the southeast, 20 knots and increasing to 30 to 35 knots once you get west of Adak through Kiska and Shemya. And along the coast, the southwest coast, look for a southwest wind 15 knots into Bristol Bay, but a northwest wind there at Kuskokwim Bay at 30 knots, and that northwest wind at 25 knots continues back out towards St. Matthew, St. Paul. Northerly winds 20 knots within Norton Sound, but 30-knot north to northwest winds off of the lower Yukon YK deltas. And for Wednesday, winds will come down a bit. Look for northwesterly winds within Norton Sound and along the Yukon Delta. And then the winds will turn a bit more westerly, Kuskokwim Bay, 20 knots, and out towards St. Paul at 15 knots. And then finally, along the Arctic coast, easterly winds 10 to 15 knots, but they switch around to the west-northwest at 15 to 20 knots coming through the Bering Strait and increase 25 to 30 knots there, west side of the Seward Peninsula and north side of St. Lawrence Island. And for Wednesday, winds will be out of the west-northwest 15 to 20 knots from Kaktovik through Utqiagvik to Point Lay, and then winds northwesterly 15 to 20 knots down through the lower Chukchi Sea, again turning more northerly 15 to 20 knots on the west side of the Seward Peninsula and the north side of St. Lawrence Island. Looking at the weather map for Tuesday afternoon, a weak low pressure over the northeastern Gulf, another low kind of spinning up as a result of energy coming in with this dissipating cold front, and by the time we get into Wednesday, we'll have a low there just southwest of the main Gulf and another cold front way out in eastern Russia.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.